PM for their speech, and I invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin off the bench. Here.
Actually, I didn't list myself down as a Dhruv. Firstly, what situation sees it done? Secondly, why is it that these necessarily are devastatingly good for the economy? Finally, then, basically the responses to most of the stuff and ask this. Firstly, what situations are they done? Oscar correctly identifies our case, and in fact, the majority of situations where this occurs, which is in situations of bubbles or, for example, large-scale financial distress, the government saves out specific companies that hire a lot of people or that are very, very large in order to prepare the windfall. Why isn't the government necessarily do this well? And the first thing I want to note is, similarly, this debate is in fact one that both sides have fiat in. So we can obviously just additionally fiat in that we put in like independent commissions or whatever to make them do it well. But three reasons why they do it well. Firstly, they've previously done this in poor situations and seen the windfalls of it economically, so they're likely to learn. Oftentimes you can earn money from bailing out affected organizations because they produce more to the economy on net, which means governments probably have that incentive to do it well. Secondly, you face scrutiny from the public, especially in the circumstances when you don't actively like target or like get rid of certain CEOs or fire them, because of the fact that everyone looks at you just gave this person money and then left. But thirdly, the impact of that is one that is specifically on the larger scale. So that is the types of companies that the opposition is suggesting that are inefficient, that are eventually going to die out, are obviously not the ones that hire vast majorities of people or the ones that don't make a significant amount of profit, which necessarily means the impact of, as we'll explain later, as what possibly can happen, are the smallest in there. So on that incentive, governments have very little situations in which they do. The second thing is like burden pushing. Like we just have to prove one situation in which this occurs, and that's probably enough, insofar as we prove sufficiently well that most of the time the governments are likely to implement it well. What are the types of stuff we support? Both the things bailout, but also things like bail-in, which is specifically that you invest in certain companies in order to give them enough capital to like lift off. But specifically in that, but also in those circumstances, the government does take large portions of the profit in return for that. And that's important because it means the government is able to prop up certain industries from the ground up and invest in things that they think are free and beneficial. One basic rebuttal, which is they say that financial institutions are able to identify and invest in rather than the government. Firstly, in most situations, it is a very risky incentive because because you don't know when you're going to get returns from airline companies or whether or not there are going to be drastic changes on COVID policy as to whether or not airlines can operate in the first place. So maybe it might be true that it costs to some extent. You do not think that's a good investment to begin with. Secondly, that is a self-propagating belief. The reason why these companies crash is because of the fact that like they do not have a service to provide and they are objectively not very effective. Their side only works on the belief that everyone in society thinks that maybe these companies are going to prop up in the future, therefore it's a good investment now, as opposed to the fact that people drastically buy out. Like that is to suggest if not everyone buys into their conception and makes the price of an airline company stay high, that it's a useless investment, right? Because that airline company then crashes down. So because there's no underlying value of the thing itself. But thirdly, there are incentives to drive down the prices for other companies. You short this company because it's far easier for you to do and makes more money. And also in the situations like Tom points out with like other banks, why would banks bail out other banks when they're their competitors? You just push towards a monopoly, steal all the market, and then you profit. So unclear as to why any of the alternatives they suggest are effective. So, what context is this likely to occur? And we will just present a series of situations as to why it's likely to be beneficial, noting that most contexts are likely to be ones that government picks well, and are ones in which, like, it is like financial nature. Firstly, contagion. That is that other companies and other people own stocks. When it is that that stock drastically drops in price, those then become worthless to individuals. This means that, for example, hedge funds that oftentimes hold people's pensions and the very thing that supports individuals, but also retail investors or individuals who hold stocks in other companies that lose money. They firstly lose money because of the fact the stock value reduces. Secondly, oftentimes you have supply chains intertwined between different corporations. Those supply chains also die out. But thirdly, you lose confidence in that industry as a whole and that company itself, which necessarily means that like, most of industries die out at that point because other companies also hold stock and stake in that company. I would know, like, for example, in the dot-com bubble, that like one phone company brand, I can't remember the name of, but kept trading months after they went bankrupt and then decimated the entire economy. Why is this important? Firstly, because this is independent of whether or not the company itself operates well. It fucks over everyone else who was operating on the idea of good faith that this company that then eventually died out was actually trading effectively. So probably it is like fine fine if we make the trade-off of, like, you know, not stopping the entire economy from dying, drastically hurting all these people. Secondly, job savings. I would know the best example of this is GFC and specifically the automobile industry, where oftentimes big corporations hire a lot of people, and you want to make sure you give them enough funding. Importantly, this funding isn't necessary for them to keep the job as it is now, but obviously you keep the lights open. But it gives them enough time to do things like retraining and effectively allocate themselves into a different part of the economy. Because sometimes the drastic drop is just too much. The sudden idea of losing your job and not being able to find somebody else to go to is necessarily incredibly important. And in situations like bubbles, where you cannot then find another job in the same sort of market, you then need to drastically retrench and look in something else. The impact of this is just like some people are able to live, right? As in they're able to pay the rent, they're able to buy food and put themselves on the table because they oftentimes do not have the savings. And a drastic change of attempting to spend months on end retraining and finding someone else is incredibly harmful, which also is an explanation as to why we only do this for the very large companies. Thirdly, monopoly protections. And that is that when one company dies out, other companies take their market, which means that you're able to more effectively market consolidate. And impacting here is that it's a lot easier for you to prevent the market from becoming consolidated and then breaking up monopolies than it is it's easier for you to stop the market from consolidating than it is for you to break up monopolies in the first place. So it's like stitch and tie, right? Which means that's far I think
corporations like car manufacturers don't take on huge amounts of financial risk. How do they actually end up being needed to be bailed out in the first place?
We literally just listen to my speech, bro. All the things about monopolies, they don't have the ability to control, but also things like sudden changes in, for example, supply chains. You lived through COVID, my brother in Christ. The important thing here, though, is that specifically on monopoly protection, you first reduce costs for consumers because price gouging, monopolies naturally lead to price gouging. But secondly, it means that you're more effectively able to, ensure good, effective products and those products are cheap. But lastly, it's necessarily a push on things that may not be profitable but are useful. For example, medical equipment for people with disabilities. And this is where bail-ins are especially important because the government is the one that needs to step in to ensure that these services are provided. Because oftentimes they aren't particularly effective, they aren't particularly profitable for the reason that they have niche markets of people who are very vulnerable and we all care about, but then necessarily might be able to profit. Secondly, why is it that governments aren't going to take, that corporations aren't going to take the risk taking like the slide suggests? The first piece of characterization is that governments are incredibly opaque on who they are necessarily going to bail out for the reason that they do not want corporations being as risk-taking, because that means they have to bail out lots of people. So they're very aggressive against the fact that we're not going to bail anyone else, and then at the last possible second step in the intersection. Why is it that instead the people are going to risk it? Firstly, we fear that you have more protections firing CEOs. I don't think CEOs want to get replaced every time they have a bailout. Secondly, we bail in, which means that they're more likely to lose control of their thing. Thirdly, governments have an incentive to play hard while it's. But lastly, the more and more times you get bailed out, you then need your volatility increases, which means you need to play your executives more and more money, and at some point it just becomes unprofitable for you to in that industry. For all these reasons, I'm so proud of this.
Right to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude opening half.
The question I have at the end of OG's case is, do they think governments are stupid and do this in all the wrong times and all the worst ways? Presume, okay, cool, I've got a response. This is the correct case, OG's kind of overlooked here. Is this that obviously governments have a huge amount of experience doing this, have a huge amount of knowledge doing this, and they have a fair bit of public scrutiny to if their intention is to over bail out, they have a fair bit of public scrutiny to push back on that, and I think that is sort stronger post the sort of GFC context. To me, it's probably most of the bailout contexts are not ones that are wasteful use of money, not ones that are kind of stupid. These businesses would kind of fail even if they got bailed out. They probably hit the appropriate amount. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is explain why specifically a government has the obligation to do this. Then I'll explain a set of additional reasons why we think governments do this well. Then I'll deal with the best claim from OG around moral hazard. Then I'll agree with our 4 explanations of when governments absolutely should be bailing out. I have two reasons why government has an obligation to do this. The first is just that obviously government's obligation is to people, and that is that we explained in our practical material there's 4 distinct contexts in which businesses failing would be so catastrophic to people and their markets. We ought to protect those businesses, not because those businesses ought to be protected, but because the people that are harmed by this, by losing their job, by not having sufficient competition in their market, by not having the specific goods that some companies provide to help those people that are most disfortunate. Those are clearly larger impacts than any sort of moral hazard, or honestly, even if CG is capable of proving that governments do this particularly badly, they're only capable of proving that governments do this too often, which means it always captures our best case scenario and their worst case scenario. But our worst case scenario is, our best case scenario is just so much more important than wasting a bit of government money in this process. We would think this probably is the government's job to waste a bit of money to protect society, and that is perfectly fine. The second and newest new claim here is that I think governments specifically have an obligation to save these businesses, and that's because the profitability of these businesses and the survival of them often are contingent on government behaviour. This is just stealing the extension I think Udai should probably run. The first is to explain that it is government regulation that often affects the profitability of these companies. Like the example we used in the opening half around COVID regulation in airlines is an example of where governments were really risk averse about their willingness to have the amount of airlines fly in and out of countries, and that is directly undercutting the profitability of those. But more importantly, the context in which we're talking about financial institutions, which is the biggest impact in this debate of leading to large contagion and stuff like that Dhruv explains, is often that those banks are heavily profitable or not based off things like government interest rates and bonds profitability, which are things that government control massively and changes the underlying kind of safest items that banks are likely to have. I don't know if you guys understand the Silicon Valley bank situation. This is what happens here. Their bonds get rapidly devalued because of interest rate decreases, which means that they were the reason that fails. And government directly caused that. Government has an obligation to rectify this problem. Why is government likely to do this particularly well? The first thing is we just provide a series of different options that government are likely to use in good situations, in particularly useful ones. They're likely to learn from things like the GFC. They're likely to bail in some situations. And bail in is likely to be particularly useful in some contexts. First, because when you own a reasonable amount of the company, you're likely to buy very cheap because that company is about to fail. And then you return it to reasonable profitability and then sell off that share again. It's likely to be far more valuable. So this is actually often likely to be pretty cost neutral or in fact profitable for businesses, for governments. And the second is just you get direct control, not total control like OG talks about. I'll respond to that stuff in a second, but you get a reasonable amount of control of these businesses. So if there is some sort of underlying problem in OG's best case scenario with this company, it's probably not so devastating the entire thing is rotten. You probably can go in there, partially control the company for a couple of years, fix its culture, fix some of its financial mismanagement, fix some of its embezzlement, whatever their best case scenario is, and resolve that. If you can't, maybe we do let some of those companies fail. We're totally fine with that. And finally, we explain there's a lot of situations where people will just be kind of scared of the bailout, which means they're probably unlikely to behave in additionally risky reasons. And that's because it's still a bad look for the business, it still harms you. You have really opaque knowledge about if this is likely to, you are likely to be bailed out, and you're personally, as say a CEO or board member, more likely to be criminally liable because of the kind of fiating we're doing this today. So I think you're likely to do this successfully, you're likely to do this in the best way possible. And the claims that I presume CG's case here about lobbying power and stuff like that, again, can only be over bailing in, which will be fine about. The second is just that obviously when these actions have occurred, there's likely to be a fair bit of clawback when you can do things like bail-ins rather than bail-outs, and politically that context has changed a lot post the GFC. Let's talk about OG's alternative to this, because they're like, we'll do government-run alternatives. I'm so confused how this fixes the problem. First, there's no explanation from OG why government-run policies by businesses would do a good job. And even if they were capable of proving that government-run alternatives do a good job, it takes a long time to set up a business. Like the problem here is that these businesses rapidly break down because of bubbles or confidence shocks or interest rate increases that Druce explained. And then once those businesses are dying or dead, there's a huge kind of vacuum in the market. You need to instantly be able to fill that by propping up that business, not pulling it apart and selling it to different companies, or in their best case scenario, setting up a government alternative. So unless they're propping socializing risky markets before the crash, which is not what this debate's about, and uses far too much fear, but I don't think they explain that their alternative works. Do you want to re-explain it?
Yeah, you also need to spend, in your own words, several years recovering a company to profitability.
Yeah, but that happens after the company continues to survive. So yes, it doesn't instantly return to profitability. There's no kind of time lag. It's kind of there and filling the gap in the market, but imperfectly, and then fills it perfectly over time. You guys have nothing for like 6 months before you start this company in your best case scenario, like maybe in China or something like that, where you can rapidly start up a government business, and then fixes the gap. That's far too slow. This needs to happen literally instantly. Otherwise, the confidence shocks, the contagion, the selling off and the supply chain breakdowns that Dhruv talks about resolves. Let's talk about moral hazard. This is OG's best argument. The first thing I'm going to do to rebut this is explain that we are okay with higher moral hazard, and then I'm going to explain why additional moral hazard does not work. The first thing is, if additional moral hazard is occurring, that just leads to higher profitability of these businesses, which we think leads to additional capacity for government and these businesses to bail themselves out. First, either just by taxation, or secondly, again, look at the Silicon Valley Bank context. The way that bank was bailed out was not all via directly government bailouts. It was by the government forcing all the other businesses in that market and some of their own money to bail out that bank, and that only occurs when government businesses are particularly profitable. So if this team thinks they're taking additional risks on, they're additionally profitable, and they're additionally able to pay back their own moral hazard and their own risk, or at least not by themselves, but by other actors in the market. So we're actually totally fine with additional risk taking if it leads to additional profit, and risk, profit, economics, you guys should probably know that. Why does additional moral hazard not even occur in their best case scenario? The first is Dhruv explains opaque risk, which means businesses don't really want to take this on. Second, we explain you're more likely to be criminally found liable. And in the best case scenario, if CG wants to extend on this, and they claim that some actors, board members or CEO, will act particularly short-termist, and then they'll take the profit and run, was obviously way more expensive now to put a new board member or a new CEO in because they've got to take on additional risk. So it's actually not very good for the business as a whole, because it comes, even if you earn more profit, you lose most of that profit by having to pay far higher wages for those individuals to take on those risks. So it's not even a good strategy in that context. We explain 4 reasons why government should always bail out banks. You only need one of them to work in one situation for us to win this debate. Very clear, all
Thank you for their speech, and I'll invite government member to begin his closing part. Here you go.
CG are going to talk about the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate today, which is banks. And this is going to frame out the extension, the kind of contributions coming out from opening up about businesses, things like corporations and car manufacturers. Because these are not the actors we're talking about when it comes to the government coming in to rescue them. 2 reasons. Firstly, these industries are often not systemically important to the economy. Like if Honda fails to build cars, like Toyota will build cars, that's totally fine. Also, secondly, these are the industries who are most likely to be bailed out by other private institutions, which means you therefore do not need government action. Which is to say, if Toyota can buy a Honda at way below the market price, they can just do so and integrate the businesses, capture more market power, and it's been an incentive to do so. Therefore, this debate is primarily about banks, and I'm going to explain 2 extensions under this. The first of which is, as Tom usefully predicts, why governments are likely to over-engage in bailout when they otherwise shouldn't, and secondly, why government intervention prior to failure is better, vertically extending on OG and explaining what policies get implemented and why no private victims are being rescued. So, onto this first extension, why governments are likely to be overzealous with buyouts. No OG fall afoul of the very simple response, which is to say, if it's so bad, why is the government going to do it? Because on their side, they can also obviously allow these banks to fail. Allow these banks to fail. So, 4 reasons as to why governments like to be overzealous and buy out shit banks. Firstly, governments are typically quite risk averse because it's incredibly difficult to assess things like contagion, which is saying even if an institution might seem unimportant, like the small regional bank, it is often still quite integrated within the economy. Which is saying if this bank fails, people might lose money, people might be able to pay off their mortgages now, and other kind of banks in the system who are more important are going to face things like credit squeezes or liquidity crisis as well. That's why, because it's so unpredictable, it means governments are particularly on being more risk averse and therefore far more likely to bail them out. The second thing is simply very electoral incentives, right? Outside of just some political parties being business aligned, the very fact that with any kind of business failing, there is, as opened quite a significant human cost in many of these instances. People will lose their jobs, people can't afford to put food on the table for their family, which therefore means these are the people who are most likely to be dissatisfied with the government when such a business fails, which means it's a very critical constituency by which they're likely to lose, which therefore means instead of just copying it on the chin because this is a business which is likely going to fail in the future, they keep it down the line. You bail them out now, and if there's a problem in the future, we're going to be fine in the short term. The third reason is to suggest that political pressure pressure and lobbying does exist, which is to say, often in these banks and often on their people they consult are former politicians and students, people who have connections to the current government, people who actually are able to influence things behind in the shady world of deals and negotiations, often do exert quite a significant amount of pressure because often their own jobs are at risk. The important thing to note is that past expectations set, particularly during the era of the GFC, means that often governments, businesses and banks expect to be bailed out when they fail, which means they're far more likely to adopt risk-taking behaviours. And therefore means the moral hazard currently exists. The problem is if the government and the moral hazard exists, but the problem here is that if a government doesn't act with it, the bank failing is going to have significant market issues because they've already behaved in a way which results in the harm to the moral hazard existing, which means the government is kind of forced into a situation where they have to bail out these banks, or otherwise worse consequences are going to exist, or even increase the risk of contagion. The last reason here is that governments can comparatively raise capital relatively easily in a relatively secure way, so they can issue bonds, and people often buy them because governments usually pay them back, and they're able to get a good return on them, which therefore means people the government has an over self-confidence in their ability to be able to sustain bailing out a bad bank, but at the same time, and as a result, are likely to do so more often. What preemptive responses do we hear from Tom trying to shadow box our extension? The first is there is more scrutiny in post-GFC. The first thing to note here is there actually more scrutiny? Like during COVID, obviously massive subsidies and massive bailouts given to banks which are failing because of the kind of exogenous situation caused by COVID. Also, secondly, it's often very easy to sell to people. We're actually helping people from keeping their jobs, which is why there's a lot of political appetite for it. And the third thing to note here is another main reasons. The next step to go is to say, well, under your side, we get our best case and also the worst case, which is why you're somewhat inclusive. The problem with this argument is that when we support never having bailouts and don't support anything at all, you cannot accrue any of the harms we talk about in those instances. What are the impacts of this? Very simple. Governments are now just don't rescue institutions which should just die. These are things which are going to cause more risk in the future, cause more volatility in the future, and it's better for them just to fail as opposed to trying to keep them alive. Now let's weigh this. Firstly, why do we weigh above OG? Very simply. Firstly, we expand the harm significantly as to why the government actually has an incentive to buy out institutions. Also, secondly, there's an actual mechanistic work they require for any of their harms to exist. Why is this going to deal with off-bench's contention about, we only need one good example? The problem with only one good example is that this is the real world, which is why governments often operate on a slippery slope. You do it once, you like to do it again and again and again. And as a result, the only way to stop this from happening and stop this creep we're having is that you set a rule, we will never bail them out. And that's the only way you can stop them. Which is why they have one good example, we've got 10 bad examples. Clearly just put away 10 bad examples over to one potentially okay one. Next, the extension I'm going to talk about is why the government intervention prior to failure is going to be better for death and CG.
Sure. Human cost argument goes the other way. Bailouts are very politically unpopular. The cultural zeitgeist is very anti-bailout. That is the reason why governments are very averse to doing
Why do they happen all the time? Secondly, now what OG try to do is they go, well, fiat exists and antitrust laws are like existent. They're very unspecific as to what this actually looks like. So I'm going to say, what do these sorts of regulations look like and why are they preferable? Firstly, I think it looks like restrictions on how much leverage a bank can take on, how much risk they can take on. Secondly, it looks like diversification requirements. Thirdly, it looks like liquidity requirements. Fourthly, it looks like effective allocation requirements. So you need to do sufficient amounts of research to invest in a particular time. This is particularly important because it means that buyers are likely to make bad decisions with other people's money. And lastly, it looks like things like risk retention regulations. So, for example, regulations which prevent people from originating really bad loans in securitization transactions. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. But for these sorts of regulations are preferable for a few reasons. The first of which is that this broadly encourages good governance as a whole, so it reduces risk right from the outset and ensures companies are likely to stay good. Secondly, it also increases more confidence in the market, so people are able to want to invest in these corporations. Thirdly, is that the cost of this is borne by institutions and not the government, which means the government has the capital to do other more socially productive things. The last note here is that when the government also has to deal with immediate liquidity crises, the actions they take is actually quite bad, and that was specificity from this team when it comes to describing it is actually going to happen. Because often in order to raise the amount of money to be able to do a bailout, you do things like quantitative easing, and that is particularly harmful for many reasons because you're putting more money to increase inflation, etc. Or for example, to verify you have to play with interest rates, and knowing that interest rates often cause things like credit squeeze, because now people are able to get less money, etc. means that is particularly harmful when banks often operate using an interbank interest rate as well, right? Which is to say, the overnight money market means you have an interest rate which is floating, which is above the current interest rates, and when you increase the current one, it also increases that, and if it's floating and not fixed, every other institution is borrowed between each other, now includes way more risk and way more volatility, and has a higher chance of things getting borrowed as well. That is why all these things explain why the thing to do, fuck up the economy in the short term, the long term stuff is what is more preferable. And even though it was a trade-off when it comes to maybe slower economic growth, the important thing to note here, we're having things going a little bit smaller. We've seen in the case of GSC, people are often overzealous, people take on more risk, people have optimism biases. I think it's far more better to curb these bad instincts which humanity has in order to create the most vulnerable people, which is actually just consumers.
I thank the government member for their speech, and I'll invite the opposition member to begin their case. Here.
First thing, sorry. Oh yeah, that problem.
And then sit down.
Sure. The first thing the closing opposition will do is provide additional context for where bailouts make sense, steering well clear of opening opposition's singular example of when this might make sense. What does this look like? Firstly, we think many instances the collapse of a particular company would be so disruptive or harmful to society writ large that justifies a bailout. Two clear examples. Firstly, the collapse of the airline Thomas Cook in the UK meant that thousands of travellers will likely be stranded in different countries without a way to get home and lose very substantial amounts of money. The British government paid to bail out that company so that it could continue operating and then be wound down after people had been able to come home. That didn't cost very much money, but it did provide a very substantial benefit for people who otherwise would be stranded. Secondly, look at companies like Country Garden in China or other large property developers, where the consequence of not bailing out means that millions of people lose their houses and lose millions of dollars that they've invested. Their entire lives are ruined as a result of that. We think in that case it is justified to engage in a bailout. Secondly, in instances of contagion, opening opposition suggests this context, but opening government demonstrates that they do not prove why it is a case of contagion occurs or what this means. We will explain it. Firstly, in many industries, public confidence is necessary for the business to exist. For example, banks or other financial institutions, where if people don't have confidence in your bank, they will take their money out, you have a bank run, and the bank collapses because it needs those deposits to be able to offset the loans that it makes. You can't do that if everyone withdraws their money from the bank. They're very likely to do so if they lose trust in the financial institution, which we can fix. But secondly, many industries are so tightly interconnected that the collapse of one company means that people who own shares or bonds in that company or are employed by that company, who have connections to that company, then have devastating impacts on their business as a result of the collapse of that one company. I.e., if your biggest customer goes down, maybe you as a supplier now are hurt, and then maybe your suppliers in turn are hurt, etc., etc. So for those kinds of contexts, it makes sense to engage in a bailout, because no matter what the government tells you about the potential costs of doing so, the costs of not doing so are the entire financial industry and the economy writ large just collapses as a result of the given-in-time meltdown of your economy. Finally, we think there are antitrust contexts where this makes sense. Like if Coles went bankrupt, you probably don't want Woolworths to literally monopolize the grocery market and brought us more than it already does. It would make sense to step in there. Second argument then, why will this be done well? Having established there are contexts where it makes sense to engage in bailouts, the question is, can we select only those contexts and not the bad ones as opening government and closing government suggest that we will? We will provide more than 3 reasons opening opposition does as to why it is likely we can pick and choose when we do bailouts very well. First reason, governments have very large amounts of technocratic expertise, they hire many economists and financial experts, and industry regulators that regulate these specific industries have lots of specific information about those industries, their outlook, whether they're profitable, whether it makes sense to engage in a bailout. Secondly, because bailouts are expensive, there's likely to be large amounts of media scrutiny and oversight from a large number of people over them occurring. Thirdly, they are inherently unpopular, which is why you had movements like Occupy Wall Street occur, literally complaining about the fat cats on Wall Street receiving the bailout. Closing government says, well, why do they occur so often? The two examples are like the GFC, the worst recession since the Great Depression, quickly a one-off incident, and COVID, a 1 in 1,000-year pandemic that literally shut down society. That's not bailouts keep happening, that's bailouts happen in very judicious circumstances where it makes a lot of sense to avoid a lot of societal harm occurring. But fourthly, governments can demand access to things like books of company to gain information about whether it makes sense to engage in the bailout. And lastly, often it doesn't cost that much to do the bailout because the government promising to back the company restores market confidence, means that the need to actually put large amounts of money into the company is reduced. When people don't fear the company's going to go down, they stop shorting it, they stop denying it access to credit, they stop, they start shopping there again, which means that the business can often recover quite quickly and quite cheaply. But lastly, we point out that it's not that hard to restore profitability if you consider the context that we talked about. If it's a temporary disruption like COVID, if it's a problem like financial contagion, often once that particular issue has been resolved, the business is just good and can go on anyway. Or in other instances of things like bank bailouts, you pass on the cost via levies on other banks, so you don't actually pay for it yourself. Or in other instances of helping victims, such as those of Thomas Cook, it's like pretty easy to do because yeah, it's expensive, but it's justified by all of the people who benefit as a result who would otherwise be out tons of money, so you have to balance the harms there. Thirdly then, let's deal with the issue of moral hazard that was raised by opening government. 5 responses. Firstly, since bailouts aren't guaranteed, there's no moral hazard. That would require people to know they would get a bailout if they act in risky ways. Since we only do them very rarely, you would not feel safe engaging in risky behaviour, knowing that a bailout would definitely save your ass. Secondly, we can prosecute the directors for mismanagement or breach of directors' duties, which is a very strong disincentive. Thirdly, the directors will almost certainly lose their jobs and reputations when we take over the company. Fourthly, shareholders and bondholders lose all their money in the bailout. Like, they don't end up okay. The government takes over their positions in the company, so they lose billions of dollars in a very strong incentive not to want that to occur, and since they appoint the directors, they have lots of control. And lastly, we point out that bailouts are structured to punish the company. They have to pay back the money at a penalty interest rate, for example, in the toxic asset release program of 2008 that bailed out the auto industry. Or the government takes a stake in the company and then has scrutiny and control over it, which the company does not like, which means that it's very punishing to be bailed out. It's not a free lunch. You don't act risky just because, oh, it'll be fine, we get bailed out. Companies don't want to be in the position of having to be bailed out because it means everyone involved loses money and reputation and does poorly as a result. Opening government.
Your context suggests instances where we should either 1, let the business get a loan from a big bank, or 2, more rigorously enforce antitrust law. If there are alternatives without the risk of moral hazard or taxpayer cost, why is this truly necessary?
That's a great question. Firstly, we would do those things anyway. We'd support stricter antitrust law, and in instances where banks could do the bailouts, we'd be happy for them to do it. This debate obviously takes place where other actors have been unwilling to engage in those bailouts. The government is a bailer out of last resort. But to address that specifically, firstly, why banks won't just bail them out. Firstly, it's often not profitable enough for banks. Banks need to make double-digit returns. They're not going to do something that is profitable but only mildly so. The government can. Secondly, often it's too risky for one individual bank that doesn't have the trillions of dollars that the government does. Thirdly, often the bank just doesn't have enough cash to engage in the bailout. Fourthly, often the competition incentives mean that you don't want to do that. Secondly, on your alternative of why doesn't the government just run a competitor? Firstly, huge time lag problem. It takes time to set up an alternative business. For example, when Thames Water, which is very likely to collapse, goes under later this year, are the people of London just not meant to drink water for 6 months while you set up an alternative? Obviously, you need to bail that out in order to provide an alternative. You can't just set up a rival water company over time. Secondly, governments tend to be bad at running companies into the long run. It's often fine to have them run the company in the short term and then refloat on the private market, but in the long run, governments tend to engage in large amounts of conflicts of interest and poor management of large state-run funds, which is why they tend to be very inefficient, and it tends to crowd out private investment from the market because you don't want to compete against the government who has limitless money and will never fail, and often can afford to run at a loss when you cannot, which means that competitors tend to leave as a result, and you tend to weaken those economies, engage in less competitive markets, and entrench the most sclerotic and poorly run businesses. Look at, for example, Pemex in Mexico running out all the other rival oil companies because it's able to take such large losses. At the end of this debate, there are a clear set of circumstances for bailouts make sense. We explained why we would only bail out in that circumstance, why moral hazard would not occur, and why alternatives were insufficient. CO clearly takes this debate.
I thank the opposition member for their speech, and I invite the government whip to conclude the government bench. Here.
context, second on contagion, and third on health. First, I'm going to explain in this speech is why opening opposition's analysis literally shouldn't matter, because the context we're talking about is not those of consumer businesses, is as the rest of the debate softly identifies, about financial institutions and also financial institutions undergoing systemic risk. There are three reasons why their context about consumer goods and also the stuff CO relies on a bit in Udai's speech simply should not matter. The first reason is because consumer businesses are the most likely to naturally receive buy-ins from other companies. That's because one, they have hard assets. That is that if you own something like a machine, that can always be sold, that can always be repurposed by another institution. Obviously, people can't repurchase financial assets which have, for instance, taken on too much risk, which are, for instance, at risk of default, which is why it's uniquely financial assets which are least likely to be bailed out, which buys into our analysis of why governments are likely to be overzealous. Second of all, we point out that consumer industries have the most diversified inputs. That is that this debate is about companies that undergo massive immediate shocks, which obviously banks are single input businesses. They rely only on the cost of capital. Consumer businesses have many inputs, like the cost of goods, like the wages, etc., which is why they're just structurally less likely to undergo the immediate shock, which leads to a situation where they need to be bailed out. But finally, we would explain that banks satisfy the question of systemic risk. That is, I do not understand why if one airline goes down, other airlines aren't able to take place, as is pointed out, which is precisely why it is only banks which are interreliant, which are the most likely to be, are actually bailed out. This contribution one explains why all of opposition's analysis about the need for consumer goods to rely on these products should not matter. Additionally, why our analysis on credit contagion is so important. So what we explain is that the context where these buyouts are most likely to be requested are those where the entire financial market is experiencing a credit squeeze. Secondly then, on contagion, opening opposition says that companies are interrelated, and therefore an industry is likely to collapse, and this is their contagion argument, right? It is like when certain companies go down, they're more likely to bring down other companies. Why is this not true? Why is this not true? The final thing I'd point out, even if you didn't believe all of our previous context, is just that often for consumer markets, the death of one business helps the other because it makes your inputs cheaper. And so often it can actually just ensure that the rest of the industry is able to prop up. We provide a far more plausible explanation of what the kind of contagion to arise from this debate is. So what we explain is that if this context is about banks undergoing systemic risk, things like increased cost of capital to service a bunch of risky loans they took on far earlier on, they're reliant on the cost of credit. And when governments engage in bailouts, no matter the context, this is hugely damaging for all other banks which rely on credit for two reasons. First of all, if the government opts to simply wipe the credits of financial institutions, whether that be through quantitative easing or whether that be through simply taking on the bank themselves, this means that they do not return the capital to the original creditor which gave the bank that loan. The problem is that it essentially sucks liquidity out of the system. It means that creditor isn't able to do things like then reinvest that money into other banks, which we explain are also likely to be in desperate need of credit, given that this is a system-wide problem, which is obviously hugely damaging for the ability of literally every other bank to survive, not just the one which is undergoing the most intense credit crunch. But secondly, if they say that the government will do things like raise money through bonds, to actually hard invest into this business, we'd explain that's just as bad. Because when governments do money raising through bonds, they do things like they actually just crowd out every other institution. The people who would buy those government bonds are people who can now no longer provide liquidity to other banks who necessarily need it, which explains why you tighten the credit crunch, which literally every other bank needs to go through. This is why our explanation of contagion is far better than opening government. Because we explain not that, well, maybe it's good these banks go down because they kind of suck. We explain why it's okay to let one bank go down if the alternative is that every other bank is now placed at risk of going down, which is the contagion argument opposition searches suggestively for. But we go further by explaining this contagion is particularly likely to happen because governments are likely to be overzealous, completing opening government and deleting opening opposition. And Udai's response is to say it's not overzealous for two reasons. Firstly, because the media observes it, but second of all, because buyouts are unpopular. The problem is that his analysis of why buyouts are unpopular do not operate in the specific moment when the government makes a decision to bail out or not. And that's because it is when people are most scared. It's when the governments have assumed for a long time that, well, we don't need to worry as much about regulation because we know in the long term, even if we're not public about it, we're able to do these kind of bailouts. And obviously, it is the moment when people are worried about their house being repossessed that I think their political inclinations would change. And maybe after the government has done a bailout where they're not scared, then people are going to be happy to occupy Wall Street. But I think in the precise moment, it is the exact incentive of the government to keep kicking the can down the road to ensure they do not incur this massive political cost. Having explained why governments are likely to intervene overzealously, this explains better than opening government why you intervene in a context where it's not necessary. But the thing I'd add here as well is that the necessary corollary of government being able to do bailout is that you cannot get the buy-ins which opening opposition suggests might be likely. And the reason for that is because buying into a dying or failing company as another private entity is costly, right? Like, it does affect your balance sheet. So this is why in their world, the companies will never accept doing buy-ins if they know that they can do things like aggressively pressure the government into doing things like bailouts, like convincing the public to pressure governments in that way, which is why opposition's context is untrue, and it's why it actually gets so much harder to do buy-ins when governments have the option to do bailouts even if they don't want to. This explains why banks are just able to engage in a set of alternatives, because obviously this harm mainly accrues where banks owe money to other banks, which is simply preferable. You can do things like give banks debt moratoriums. You can do things like accept the exchange of risky assets, which the bank in the tightest credit crunch hates because they need the short-term returns, but you who have higher liquidity are able to accept in the long term, which is why you just get a bunch of efficacious trades which are able to prevent the immediate credit crunch in a way which is particularly useful. Opening.
So Silicon Valley Bank got bailed out earlier this year. Can you list the other banks in the US that are having this credit crunch you speak of?
Well, it's like, obviously, one, even if a credit crunch doesn't lead to a bank going under, it can still elicit a range of harms. Like individual people not getting this kind of returns they want, individual people not being able to pay off their mortgages because their rates are going up or access capital. But B, it's not my fault I don't read the news. Final part of the argument, Zero obviously tries to explain, well, the contagion that's important is the institutional trust. First of all our previous analysis about why buy-ins get more common suggests to you that institutional trust will also be fine on the outside. But secondly, we'd explain that that CO has an alternative problem. Because if it's systemic risk, people can't just decide that they're not going to have savings. Obviously, you need to put it in some bank. We explain why every bank is undergoing this crisis. The alternative, though, is that governments can manage capital. We explain why they can engage in things like quantitative easing, which literally deletes liquidity from the system, which is likely to lead to the kind of contagion they actually describe. Finally, on the health of financial markets, this is, first of all, where we do far better than our opening government. Because we actually mechanise why the government is likely to engage in early regulation. Because if you're a government regulator, it's politically costly to engage in, to intervene in the financial market and upset your lobbyists. But, so, when you have the alternative of a bailout later on, you have less impetus to do it, you don't actually do that regulation. Obviously, never doing bailouts changes the calculus uniquely in opposition, that's far better than opening government. But secondly, on moral hazards, we would explain that our analysis as to why financial markets are competitive and fight for the same capital is the best reason why you have to engage in the moral hazard. Because if you don't, a manager who's willing to, or a bank who's willing to, will take the money away so that you don't get to make that profit. Very proud to oppose.
I'll take the government word for their speech, and I'll invite the opposition to conclude the debate. Yeah.
I'm going to start with CG. I want to start with their more plausible extension about overzealousness. I'm going to directly respond to the premises they give. Number one, they say this is likely to be done overzealously because of a mass human cost, so jobs are going to be lost. The government needs to step in. Number one, I think the opposite is likely true. People hate bailouts. The cultural zeitgeist is very anti-bailout and fallout of the GFC. But secondly, they don't demonstrate bailouts are the only way to respond to this human cost. There are alternatives, things like income support and welfare, for example. So that seems unlikely. Secondly, they talk about how the government is very risk-averse and they don't want contagion. That is not a logical reason why I think the government just always responds to doing a bailout. That is a reason why governments ought to be selective and investigate the risk of contagion, which is why our extension, which demonstrates the different methods in which governments can use their expertise, analyse the books, have regulators which understand the industry, is very important. It's a direct response to this argument by demonstrating that governments are able to do this selectively rather than just being overzealous. Thirdly, they talk about lobbying. I think, number one, unclear that lobbying only happens insofar as it's like business wants bailout. Is also there are other businesses that want to have a monopoly and would lobby for the bailout not to happen as well. But also, I think the explanation given is very cliche. It's just like, oh, there's lobbying that takes place in the back room, pretty scary. I don't think that is sufficient as well. The fourth thing they say is, well, banks deliberately set up in a way where they can be structured in the way they need to be bailed out. Number one, do not think this is true. I think it's very likely we have heavy regulation, especially in the fallout of the GFC as well. And if there isn't, we have the fiatness debate to say, well, to support interventions into the market to prevent banks from structuring this way as well. I think all this stuff about overzealousness does not make sense logically and cannot be credited. Second thing I think we get from CG then is this push about credit. I think number one, the argument I've already given you earlier on in this speech about banks being tightly regulated, like things like deposit insurance, for example, I think are reasons to believe why this sort of like credit argument doesn't really make sense in the current regulatory environment. But secondly, also bailouts are being done by like the Fed, by reserve banks, for example. It's not just being done through the issuing of bonds and like increasing taxes, right? Like you can literally print the money and you reaccumulate it later because the bailout is in the form of a loan, which you then reaccumulate over time as well. So again, I think this is a pretty desperate extension. I do not think it works in this debate. Secondly though, talking about our extension and positioning it over CG and over OO in particular, I think our extension in this debate is quite good. Because side opening opposition is very narrow in the set of circumstances they identify where bailouts make sense. They spend about 90% of their case on the one example of like contagion, where companies are interconnected. But we greatly expand on that at side closing opposition. We tell you about examples where people would otherwise lose their homes or savings. We tell you about instances of antitrust where otherwise you would have one company monopolizing that market, being able to jack up prices and decrease the ability of consumers to get a good deal. Tell you about instances where there are third-party harms and victims, like instances where Thomas Cook left people stranded and unable to return back to the UK because there was no government support given to that business and they were allowed to fail. We tell you about instances in which the USU alternative are things like a literal run on the banks, which would literally lead to mass contagion and mass economic destabilization as well. I think we get over our opening in terms of scale of argument here, given they, I think, identify maybe 10% of the circumstances where a bailout might take place. We give you the other 90%, I think is far higher in terms of scale of impact there as well. Additionally though, I think we also give you additional line, they give you maybe like one line of analysis about monopoly. They say, well, this stops monopolies from forming, full stop, end of story. Number one, I think this then relies on the analysis we give you at side closing opposition about why governments would do this well, would selectively intervene, prevent monopolies from forming. But secondly, I don't actually think they elaborate on this. We actually tell you, I think, a more concrete line of analysis at Udai about why this is so harmful. We explain why it's unlikely you want to have just coals gobbling up the entire market, like, for example, consumer goods, just for one example of what that would look like. It's clear that would be bad for consumers as well. So for those reasons, I think our extension stands in this debate. Now, I know that I think Sam is woefully unresponsive to the line of analysis, other than just to whip their extension a little bit, which I think I've already explained does not work in this debate. But even let's say you get overs, okay, no, but let's now position, I think, our extension in terms of directly responding to CG. Number one, we give you a set of reasons that Udai to explain governments would be highly selective with doing this as well. Things like they have regulators and expertise, things like they have the ability to, demand access to books. You have people who have specific knowledge about certain industries. The thing is, the reason why the government has a very high level of expertise, they're unlikely to just run around like chickens without their heads cutting off, bailing out every second business. I think there is a much more plausible set of arguments in this debate as well. I'll take the point from it.
Why would Coles or that airline you described in the UK not get a loan?
Why would they not get a loan? Well, there's a few reasons for that. Number one is that bailouts tend to take place, I think, in an environment where we're unlikely to want to get out loans. It tends to be in a fairly economically precarious environment. Number two, often it takes place where there's quite a high level of uncertainty. So it's not the case that it's just oh, the airline company is going to come back very shortly in the future. It is, we don't know when the market is going to resolve itself. So the government must step in and bail these companies out because banks are not going to be doing this as well. So I think there are a set of reasons why when bailouts take place, it is of a last resort and those other avenues have been exhausted. The government should not stop that from being an opportunity. But lastly though, let's continue get to side opening government. I think side opening government relies on, I think, a line of analysis about how businesses that would otherwise be bailed out have inherent problems and ought be allowed to fail. To believe that, you must believe that all of these failing businesses demonstrate some inherent flaws, which is not demonstrated. But secondly, that also government is bad at selecting which specific businesses to bail out. Which is something attempt to rebut, but they give you a set of incentives why the government would do this, has reasons to want to do this well, but they do not actually mechanize the ways in which governments are able to select which companies to bail out properly, which is the analytical hole that we plug in Udai's extension. We tell you a series of reasons, which I've already explained earlier on in the speech, as to why the government has the expertise and has the ability to selectively determine which, for example, bailouts are likely to prevent contagion, bailouts are likely to increase confidence in the market, bailouts are likely to decrease the ability of monopolies to form specifically. The second argument they give about moral hazard, I think, number one, we give you a stronger set of reasons around why moral hazard is unlikely to be a consideration in this debate. Like, for example, in addition to being able to prosecute CEOs, we also are able to do things like take a stake in the business, which shareholders obviously do not want, which is a big incentive and great in our opening. So they talk just about the CEOs. We talk about the shareholders who are actually making voting decisions, which is a big, stronger and bigger reason why I think moral hazard does not apply. For these reasons, vote zero.